The distinctive danger of propaganda in a liberal democracy is that it goes unnoticed. It is hard to think of a better way to exhibit this distinctive danger than by reflection on the fact that philosophy professors in liberal democratic societies assume that there is a distinctive and easily identifiable class of words, the function of which is to decrease reasonableness, which have this effect wherever they occur in a sentence. My name is Jason Stanley. I'm the Jacob Urofsky Professor of Philosophy at Yale University.
Jason Stanley's most recent book is called How Propaganda Works.
As I see it, the talk of post-truth suggests that history goes in a progression and we are now entering a novel phase, a post-truth phase.
What are the markers that tell us that we're moving into that stage?
Well, I have some problem with the vocabulary of post-truth because I disagree with that description of what's occurring. So I think that what's happening is that we are slipping back into phases, namely authoritarian or monarchical phases. And democracy, truth phases, are very infrequent in history. They're very infrequent in history, and they're very infrequent at any time in history across the globe. I think post-truth or pre-truth or non-truth societies are the norm. And truth societies, societies governed by respect for truth, are the exception.
What unnoticed bits of propaganda have you noticed the most?
The propaganda of liberal democracies is that there is no propaganda. But I think that we've shifted into a distinct phase very recently with our recent election. I think that before our election, there's always been propaganda in liberal democracies. Politicians take advantage of the fact that people believe there is no propaganda. But if they're caught, there's often punishment. Now, what's happened most recently in our most recent election is that when politicians were caught issuing falsehoods, there was no punishment whatsoever. In fact, they were almost rewarded for it. And the media has yet to catch up with that shift in the public culture.
Are there any other differences between what we might call totalitarian propaganda and the kind of propaganda that you're seeing now in the United States? I mean, you're saying that part of liberal democracy propaganda is that there's no propaganda. Are there any other differences, though?
Well, I think that we've shifted into an authoritarian propaganda moment in the United States in our previous elections. So I think that we've shifted into a phase where, although there's no evidence that the president-elect has an anti-democratic ideology, the strategy he has employed in his political campaign has been authoritarian in nature. Both the rallies and the chanting at the rallies, I could go into more detail on that, as well as the redefining of reality.
I'm intrigued because you said that this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that has historical roots, indeed goes back a long, long time. And I want to go back a bit and let's discuss the original messages that were sent out from the church, as I understand it, about people telling untruths. And that was what propaganda was. It was in a sense something that was trying to force pagans to be more Christian.
Yes, of course, the church was thought of itself as delivering the truth, and propaganda, the word, comes from the Catholic Church, and the idea was to instill, to spread the doctrine of the church. So propaganda, the term, didn't carry negative connotations until the 20th century, until authoritarian regimes such as Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, the brutal communist dictatorships of Eastern Europe, and Cuba, North Korea. So propaganda acquired pejorative connotations then, and it acquired pejorative connotations in liberal democratic regimes after World War I. Walter Lippmann was the editor of the New Republic during World War I, and used propaganda to get Americans very militarized and behind the World War I effort. And then after the war, Lippmann became extremely concerned about the power of propaganda, the power of these falsehoods. And though propaganda doesn't need to be false. But he became concerned about what he himself did, and then he wrote about its dangers. And propaganda in wartime always emerges. We saw that in it's no accident that this election season follows so closely upon a major war, the 2003 Iraq War, in which we had a large amount of bending of reality for policy goals.
How have things changed more recently? And that means, I guess, in the context of the Trump election, I mean, what is the relationship now between propaganda and not truth, but post-truth?
Well, now I think, so I need to back up and explain a little bit about what a liberal democratic society is to get at post-truth. I mean, a liberal democratic society is one that values liberty and equal respect. Because if you value liberty, you value your fellow citizens' liberty. You want them all to have liberty. So you need to give them equal respect so they can tell you when their liberty is being impinged upon. And truth is the guarantee for equal respect. Because if you value truth, then you have to listen to those if you want to give those with less power equal respect, then, you have to listen to them. You have to make sure that your views about them aren't false. So truth is the sort of leveler between those with less power and those with more power that ensures that you're not impinging on the autonomy of those with less power. So in an authoritarian society, by contrast, in a monarchy, for instance, and all human societies were almost all human societies, especially in the West, were monarchies until recently. So certainly in the West, in Western Europe. So in monarchies, the main principle is not truth, but the main principle is power. And what you're doing when you're in an authoritarian society, people learn to respect power. And so in an authoritarian society, an authoritarian leader will demonstrate their power by defining reality. So they will feel free to define reality so it accords with the ideology that they want you to have.
They've got a monopoly on truth.
They have a monopoly on truth. That's exactly right. And people don't punish them for saying false things because they've shifted their cultural norms to power. They admire power now. And when President-elect Trump speaks of the movement, I fear he's speaking of a movement of people who respect him as the one with a monopoly on truth, who view power and his exhibition of power as what should be praised and exalted.
You're listening to Ideas on SiriusXM, CBC Radio 1, and cbc.ca/ideas. I'm Paul Kennedy with an episode we're calling The Truth About Post-Truth. The post-truth era in popular culture may well be the offspring of post-structuralist and postmodern thinking within the academy. If what we call the truth is ultimately a function of perspective, then what prevails is just the product of power. As Friedrich Nietzsche once said, a mobile army of metaphors, illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are. My truth, your truth, do-it-yourself truth. Some believe we're in danger of pulling the epistemological rug out from under our own feet. Others believe we've already done that. I want to get a clearer understanding, though, of what's different about now. And I guess, the question is, you said propaganda has been around for a long time, and I certainly buy into that as a suggestion, but I'm wondering if propaganda, because it's been around a long time, isn't very, very unique or different. That, every argument that anyone has ever made, even in our current situation, can be called propaganda.
I think when you keep on referring to our current situation, I'm reminded of the strong difference between Canadian political culture and current U.S. political culture.
Okay.
I think it's very important to distinguish propaganda from cherry picking facts, for example, or giving an argument from a perspective, because then every argument is propaganda.
Right.
So I criticize the classical definition of propaganda as biased arguments, because every time you give an argument, you're highlighting certain facts over others. But that's different from giving an argument that has premises that are false. I may say, look, this population commits lots of crimes. And then you look and you see that statistically that population does commit lots of crimes. And I may use that in an argument to that we should have harsher punitive measures against them. But then you could respond by making a true claim that the population is extremely poor and has many less resources than other citizens. And this is an explanation of why they commit crimes, and therefore a punitive response is not required. We should rather make up the inequalities. So that's an argument in a liberal democratic society where one party gives an argument for punitive measures with a true premise, and the other person responds by saying, sure, your premise is true, but you've left some crucial facts out. So there you've got respect for facts, you've got biased arguments, but all arguments are given from a perspective because we don't have infinite time. We can't consider every possibility. We can't consider everything because we only live a certain number, 80 years if we're lucky. So we need to back off a definition of propaganda that is characterized in terms of bias or such like. So I give a narrower definition of propaganda. So I characterize one kind of propaganda as the use of political ideals against themselves. And the other kind of propaganda I characterize is the kind you find in authoritarian societies, where you try to overwhelm the use of rationality and reason with emotions detached from ideas. So you try to heighten fear. You try to heighten anger. And to such a degree where people can't evaluate arguments anymore. They're just overwhelmed.
I wonder what we're supposed to do, though, in that kind of context. I mean, if we can't use truth or we can't use reason, rationality as the litmus paper and by which we test all of these things, what are we left with? Do we shout louder than the people we're trying to defeat and thereby establish our point of view?
I do not think so. I think we double down on liberal democratic norms. And I think you see the President Obama doing that. He's stepping down. He's not challenging anything. He's has respect for the president-elect. And the president-elect has shown some respect for President Obama. So I think it's very important to adhere to liberal democratic norms. We must remember that liberal democracy is a system that was considered impossible for thousands of years. And it could be that liberal democracy has had its moment, and the liberal democratic order is collapsing, and we are joining the 90% of the world that lives under authoritarianism. Athenian democracy only lasted for a few hundred years. But I think we cannot shout louder. We must simply double down on liberal democratic norms. We must demand that our politicians speak the truth. We must denounce them when they issue falsehoods. But we must not engage in the propaganda in the kind of fear-mongering and scaremongering and hate-mongering that confronts those of us who are deeply wedded to freedom.